And not only that, she was an orphan. She didn't have any parents. Only her cousin Mordecai was the one that was there to take care of her. And we can also see in Esther's story that how we can witness during a time of trouble, during a time of persecution, even if it means facing death. And it gives us some principles on how we can witness during that time, even if at the cost of our own lives, in order to help save others, right? So let's turn to Sunday. Sunday of our story this week, and let's turn to Esther 1. We're going to read a little background on Esther 1, verse 2 to 20. Now, who has a loud, booming voice that everyone can hear that they can read for us today? Esther 1, verse 2 to 20. Gary, you want to read that for us?
I haven't got it. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
He's working on it.
All right, no problem. Who wants to read that for us? Esther 1, verse 2 to 20. Very loud and clear. Go ahead, Carrie. Thank you. All right, so it looks like a whole bunch of things happen in Esther 1. So what are some of the things that are key here that you can see that happened during in Esther 1, verse 2 to 20? Well, first of all, what's happening? There's a big feast, right? King, it's hard for me to say his name, Ahasuerus, right? King Ahasuerus, or King Xerxes, right? He's holding a feast, but for how many days is he holding it?
6 months.
A whole week, but he's holding it first for how many months? 6 months. 180 days. Can you imagine, even though he's very wealthy, but can you hold a feast for just your servants and for the people of your court for half a year? It's quite imagining to see how much he was really pretty extravagant. You can see that there, that King Ahasuerus. And so after he went through those 180 days, it still wasn't enough. He still wanted another week of feasting, but this time he invited all the men, right, from the city to come and to have a feast with them. And you could tell that in the beginning, in verse 6 and verse 7, notice how the writer of Queen Esther actually goes into so much significant detail of how rich King Ahasuerus is, that they go into so much detail. And then in verse 8, you can also see that they're drinking. At first, they're drinking moderately, right? Because it says they're drinking according to the law, which is modestly. But then he allows them, when the week comes, right, that 1 week of feasting when all the men come in, then he tells the servants, give them whatever they want, according to their pleasure, however much wine that they want, give it to them, right? So already there we know that the king has been feasting for too long, that it has already clouded his judgment, that he's already going against what is normally commanded to have, a wine at the feast. And then so when he does that, he allows them to have as much wine as they want. Then what's the thing that he does? He calls for his wife, the queen of the household, to come and to be presented before all the men of the city, right? And to just show herself, because she was queen and she was beautiful, right? Now, what are some of the things that are hard to understand during verse 2 to 20? In that day and age, what are some of the things that we find that are hard to understand?
How they could feast that long a time.
Right, having a feast that long of a time, half a year. Anything else that you guys might see in verse? That the men and the women were split. Notice that Vashti was having her own feast for the women of her own household. And we can see that the men actually had power in that time of Persia, and that they could do what they wanted, and women weren't treated that well during that time, right? Right.
There was a division.
Right.
And so what was going on in the King's Court area is completely, they only had information that was revealed to them. But when it came down to where he was spending all this time with his little drunk and his reasoning about the honor that he had when he was asked to bring his queen Vashti in, she was a queen in those days, was kept out of sight from the public eye.
That's right.
And it was almost like a private thing for the king to have only this beauty for himself.
Right.
And so he was, bringing her into public and displaying her. And he didn't realize, I don't believe at that time, how much dishonor he was bringing to himself.
That's right.
It was not only what he was doing to Vashti, but to himself.
Right.
In front of all those people, he was doing it to himself.
Right. And notice how, although we don't exactly know what Vashti says in her refusal to come forward to the king, right? It doesn't say in Esther of what exactly that she says, but it does say that she refused to come, right? And notice how the first thought in the men's minds were like, well, she's going to influence all the other women in the kingdom. Now, how would you feel if the very first thing that they thought of is that she's going to influence all the women and now they're going to disobey their husbands? But it also shows, you can also tell in that time that the queen does have influence upon the women of the kingdom. But they always think, of course, wine has already clouded their judgment, so now the very first thing, that even Vashti, in a sense, she was a missionary in herself, meaning that she stood for dignity and honor, that even though the king wasn't in his right mind, she still sent a message to the kingdom that, hey, I'm still the queen of this household. I still want to preserve my dignity and purity, as a queen, as my position that I should hold, right? Regardless of whether it is the king in his position, right? But already we know that wine has already clouded his judgment.
I wonder, she sent a message. Now, let's take a little different. What if she left her presence, went to the king, and gave the message personally? But things have changed.
I believe it would have changed, but at the same
She
time,
didn't have to. She was giving her opinion in front of the others for me because the man, she was saying, just like Vashti, like Esther had done, it's how you approach somebody. And I don't know, it was just a thought to me. Is
Yeah.
that she was in the presence and spoke to him directly. There's a difference when you get a letter in the mail and standing in front of somebody. You can answer more questions than what is perceived in the words.
it's true.
And so, that's why I often think is that maybe your personal relationship with Christ is more where we talk.
That's right.
I don't know, just a thought.
It's a good thought. But then we also have to ask, would it have been wise to her to say anything? Because she was just called to come and to present herself. Not to speak, not to talk, not unless the king commanded to. So there's a whole different bunch of stipulations in her coming forward. So yeah, we could definitely look into that too. So you can tell the type of environment that Esther is going to enter into and the type of environment she's going to be a witness to, right? Now let's turn to 1 Corinthians 9, verse 19 to 23. So it can give us a gauge of how we are to witness in different types of environment, right? We deal with different people every day. We all have different professions. We all have different jobs. So Paul gives us in 1 Corinthians 9, verse 19 to 23, a little gauge of how Esther, it sets the stage for how Esther is to be a witness among a foreign land and especially in the Persian court. 1 Corinthians 9, verse 19 and 23. Jung, would you like to read that for us?
Although I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win them all. And to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without the law, as without the law, not being without law toward God, but under law toward Christ, that I might win those who are without law. To the weak I became as weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save more. Now this I do for the gospel's sake, that I may be partaker of it with you.
So we see there's a certain principle that Paul brings out here and how we are to witness in different situations with different people every day. Now we can apply this to Esther. What is this principle that Paul is bringing out here that we should use in witnessing to different people every day? Does anybody know the principle that Paul is bringing out here?
As far as possible, we should go along with the other people that we are with,
Right.
and that we associate with or work with, be a part of as far as possible.
That's right. And that's very true. As far as possible, without compromising, right? Biblical principle, we should find common ground with people. And that we should actually use that to our advantage in order to witness to them. For example, when I used to do colporting, we would always try to find something to connect with the person at the door. Because you can't just say, well, here's my book, buy it. Will you buy it? No, you have to find some type of connection so that the person may be opening to buying the book in the first place. For example, I would usually present Steps to Christ. And if I find out that that person is a Christian, and I usually ask, are you a singer? And sometimes when they say yes, on page 50 of Peace Above the Storm, which is the Magabook version of Steps to Christ, I would usually show them, Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing. And many people that I find at the door, when I sing to them, it actually opens a doorway for them to get Steps to Christ. And so I try to find that common ground, or I try to look, well, what is your family like? How many children do you have in your family? Sometimes they'll say, well, I'm actually the youngest. I'll be like, hey, I'm the youngest. I was like, that's something that's in common that I could actually find with you. So now we see in setting the stage for Esther, if she had not been queen, would she even have an influence in the Persian court in the first place? No. And so that's why she had to have that position in order to find a really strong influence upon the king and upon the Persian court as well. And so let's look at Monday. Oh, one question though. At the end, when Vashti disappears from history, we no longer hear from her. We no longer know what happened of her, right? So it says in the question at the bottom of Sunday, it says, in the end, why should we take principle stands even if we don't know the outcome of the action? So why should we even take a stand for principle even if we're unsure of what the action is, right? For Vashti, we know that her end wasn't a good end, right? But for Esther, it was different, right? So why should we take a stand for principle even if we're unsure of what the consequences are going to be? Right. It's a good one. So we don't know if the seed is planted and the impact that it has at that time. Anybody else?
You have to trust God under all circumstances. And I mean, we have the promise in Romans 8:28. All things work out for the good of those who love Him. Those are the mentality and the will and the decision that these people made.
Right.
Joseph and Daniel, under all circumstances, they purpose in their heart to remain faithful, regardless. Sometimes it turns out for the worst. Like
Sometimes
Joseph
it doesn't.
ending in prison, and Daniel and 3 friends were going through these difficult situations. You simply have to trust God that He has a plan.
That's true, and that's where our faith comes into play. Whether we truly have that relationship with God and to trust in Him, right? And standing for principle, it drives a deeper impact for the gospel rather than staying quiet and not saying anything, right? For example, even with the 3 Hebrew boys, right? They didn't have to, they're given a decree that they should bow down to that golden image. And, they could have just bowed down like the rest of the other Jews who were there present in the city, but yet they chose to stand up, even if it meant death. And that's a good question for us to ask of ourselves. In the face of death or in the face of persecution, will we stand for God and trust in Him, even if the outcome comes that we will no longer live, right? We see it with different characters of the Bible.
Romans 8:28 is still true.
It's still true. It still stands. And God still gives us that promise. And notice even with the answer of the Hebrew boys, and He says, even if our God does not save us, we will still not bow down, right? So I pray that we may apply that to our own lives, that even when it comes in the face of death, we will be able to tell, even if our God does not save us, we will not bow down to your gods, right? And that's a greater witness than not saying anything at all, right?
We're told that that's what's going to happen to us in the last days.
That's right. And that's why Esther is such a significant story. I mean, a lot of people say that Esther is a wonderful love story, but really, no, it's actually a representation of what's going to happen to God's people in the last days. Very true. Let's turn to Monday.
Empire, when they put a law into effect, it was permanent, it could be taken out.
That's right.
When God puts a law into effect, man doesn't get to take it out.
No.
It's a principle that's here showing where a country had a principle in law. And when the king said this was it, this was it.
That's right.
And so when you look at that, you look at the law that God sets down, it isn't for us to choose the way we want it.
That's right.
We obey what it is.
Right.
And so that's part of this too. We have to keep in mind God's law as well as the way the Persians had their law.
That's where the principle comes in. We ought to obey God rather than men, right? So let's turn to Esther 2, verse 10 and 20. Esther 2, verse 10 and 20. Now we're going to look at Esther coming into the scene. We've already looked at Vashti, and now her time is over. But now Esther is now being brought to the scene. Esther 2, verse 10 and 20. Bob, you want to read that for us? Esther 2, verse 10 and 20.
Esther had not showed her people, nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her that she should not show it. And Mordecai walked every day before the court of the women's house to know how Esther did, what should become of her. Now when every maid turn was come to go into King Ahasuerus. After that, it had been 12 months, according to the manner of the women.
Oh, just 10 and 20, Bob. 10 and 20, not 10 to 20. Yeah.
Well, verse 20. Esther had not yet showed her kindred, nor her people, as Mordecai had charged her. For Esther did the commandment of Mordecai, like as when she was brought up with him.
Now, why would Mordecai actually give such a request to Esther as she's going in to the Persian court? Why would he charge her to do that, even though there's no physical threat yet, right? Haman hasn't come into the scene yet, nor has he laid any threat towards the Jewish people. Why would Mordecai take that time to say, don't share with them who you are? Don't share your identity yet, right? Why would he take that time? Looking back to Esther 1, what type of environment is she going into? No. Obviously, it's not quite friendly to women at the time, right? And not only that, they're in a foreign land and she's Jewish, right? And they're captives in a foreign land. So there's already a prejudice there that being a captive, she's the lowest of the low in the totem pole in that kingdom, right? Why else? Why would Mordecai take that time to tell Esther, don't tell them of who you are, don't tell them that you're Jewish just yet? Is there wisdom in not showing who we are at a certain time?
She was concealed at the time of where she was at. Mordecai was not ashamed of being a descendant of Abraham. No.
Definitely
But
not.
at the time and place, they were still slaves.
Right.
So at the time and place, God has a purpose and a time. And he asked her to conceal it. He didn't say deny.
Right.
There's a difference.
Right.
And so that question never came about. And God's in control. So I think that it was just Mordecai's relationship with God. He didn't see the need at that time to project. It's a time and a place.
So in that saying that, is there a certain place and time where we'd be bold and say that we are Seventh-day Adventists? And are there other times where we have to keep quiet and not denying, but the fact that we are Seventh-day Adventists, just not saying out loud that we are Seventh-day Adventists? Has anybody ever gone through that type of situation where you didn't really say you're Seventh-day Adventist? That's right. Exactly, and I can attest to that too. When I go door to door, and when people ask me, what church do you represent? I don't say I represent the Seventh-day Adventist Church right away, because people already have prejudice in their mind of who we are. They say we're a cult, we're those healthy eating people, right? Or they have all these different images of who we are as Seventh-day Adventists. I've even had a person say that you're just the same as Jehovah's Witnesses. And so, a lot of people have these different images of who we are and what we believe in. And so when I go, it's first and foremost, the first thing that matters in going and being able to share with people the gospel is that you first have to become their friend. In order to really gauge the gospel with them and give it to them, you have to learn how to be their friend first. And so Mordecai, there was wisdom in him actually telling Esther to conceal herself and actually revealing of who she was, because it wasn't time yet. And I also believe wholeheartedly that the Lord had given him wisdom not to share with who she is first, because maybe for a later time, which we'll look into Esther, that there will be a time where she has to reveal herself and to the king. Are you going to say something, Bob?
I was kind of thinking about worship. This king wanting to worship. He was expecting God. And no Jewish name worship.
Definitely. There will be a clash of worship. Yes, John?
You know, if you look at the history of Jews and Persians, already the Jewish people were in favor with the king, previous king, King Darius and Cyrus. They all gave permission for Jews to return. And what business are these people remaining back there? We don't know.
It's true.
Most of them are there because they don't want to suffer the hardships. So it must have God's, providence that He kept some of them back, just as such for this kind of trouble. So Mordecai, being man of God, he was strongly, probably impressed by God, not to divulge these things. He doesn't know the reason. We don't know the reason.
We don't know the reason, yeah.
So eventually God, as you said, impressing him. The king is looking for just a beautiful virgin. That's all that matters.
Yes.
You don't have to say anything else.
Yes.
To the humanistic guys, that's all they're looking for right now. To please the king.
And that's very true. We don't necessarily know the reason. Esther doesn't tell the reason why Mordecai, gives her those instructions. But we know in the Lord and His wisdom and impressing upon His people to do such things, even when we don't know the real reason why we're doing it. But that's where we trust in faith, right? To go forward with the command or the impression that the Holy Spirit gives us, right?
One of the things is like, if you look at Esther, is that it's her character. It's a transformation of God in her life. That is what people need to see, and not the Seventh-day Adventists.
Yeah.
But it's the transformation of Jesus in our life. When they see that, and they like that, they will like being a Seventh-day Adventist.
Right.
But the thing about it, this is what Mordecai is kind of conveying, is that she was raised by him, with this character, this relationship. And so, it wasn't the outward part that counted. She didn't put on all this ornaments and everything else on herself. She listened to this man, the eunuch, who was with her, and she was very much herself. It was the inside that the king loved.
That's right.
It wasn't all the things that were on her. So here we have what talks about the inside character of an individual. When we meet somebody, we meet them from inside, with Jesus inside of us.
And that's a good point to point out, because notice how Esther, she doesn't go against what Mordecai says. In fact, she's obedient and humble to go forward, even if it means her life, right? So let's go. Let's turn to John 4, verse 1, just to John 4, verse 1 to 6. We're going to go there and we're going to see a contrast on how Christ brings about a contrast for us in that with the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman at the well. So John chapter 4, verses 1 to verse 7. John chapter 4, verses 1 to 7. Who wants to read that for us? John chapter 4, verse 1 to 7. Adrian, you want to read that for us?
Therefore, when the Lord knew that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus himself was not baptizing, but his disciples were, he left Judea and went away again into Galilee. And he had to pass through Samaria. So he came to a city of Samaria called Sychar, near the parcel of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. And Joseph's well was there. So Jesus, being wearied from his journey, was sitting thus by the well, and was about the 6th hour. And there came a woman of Samaria to draw water. Jesus said to her, Give me a drink.
So we know that this familiar story with Christ and coming to the woman at the well, right? Now, in John 4, verse 1 to 26, Jesus is more bold in proclaiming that he is the Messiah to her more than his own people. Why? Why is that? In contrast to how Mordecai, right, he tells Esther to conceal her heritage of who she is as a Jew. But when Jesus meets the woman at the well, he's bold enough to say that I am the Messiah to her. Why? She's not judging him? It's very true, very true. But notice there's a process, though, in verse 1 to 26. Before he reveals that he's the Messiah to her boldly, there's some prejudices that he has to break down before he reveals to her that he's the Messiah. Were you going to say something, Joe? Oh, okay. Why would Jesus be even more bold to say, hey, I'm the Messiah, to the woman at the well? But in contrast to Mordecai and with Esther, right, he tells her to conceal of who her true identity is. Why would he reveal to this Samaritan woman in comparison to his own people of who he really is?
You know, him being the Lord, also him being impressed by Holy Spirit. The verse says he need to go to Samaria. So he knew that there is a people or person that needs the gospel message. And people who are ready to accept the gospel message without prejudices in, sense that, they have these set ideas who Messiah is.
Right.
But these people are different, even though they are become part of the Israel. He knew that there are people that are willing to accept.
That's very true, because already the Jewish people, remember, in versus the Samaritans, the Jewish and the Samaritans, of course they didn't like each other, and the only thing that the Jews would have to do with the Samaritans is trade. And that's all, as long as they would allow. They would not be with each other socially, right? So Jesus already knew the prejudice of his people at the time. And not only that, he knew that a lot of his people didn't really know how the Messiah was to come, right? So he had to be tactful. And so that's a lesson for us, with Mordecai and Esther being in a foreign land. She had to be tactful in the way that she went about, right? Just like when we meet different people and as we witness to others, right, in our character, different people, we react with them in different ways, right? And we share with them in different ways. Some we may be more boldly to say that, hey, I'm a Seventh-day Adventist and we have the 3 angels messages, right? For others, it may take a little longer. And that's where God gives us the tact and the wisdom to say, in the right timing, that we get to reveal of who we are, right? And not only that, Jesus knew that this woman was more open than his own people to be able to share the gospel with others. Notice how at the end of the chapter in John 4, she goes and tells all the men of the city, right? And she doesn't say, hey, I know the gospel and you don't. No, she goes and tells them and says, come and see. She gives them an invitation. And notice how she's an even more effective missionary than his own disciples. And so definitely the Lord gives us tact. There's times where we may be bold to proclaim of who we are. And there's also times where it may take time for us to reveal to people of who we are. In Desire of Ages, page 190, she says, Christ was far more reserved when he spoke to them than being his own people. That which had been withheld from the Jews, and which the disciples were afterward enjoined to keep secret, was revealed to her. Jesus saw that she would make use of her knowledge in bringing others to share his grace. And so not only that did she bring those people, but when they came, they saw Jesus, they experienced him for himself. He stayed for 2 more days to witness to even more people in Samaria. And that was way more people that he was able to witness to and to win to the gospel than his own people in Nazareth, right? So it's a good principle for us to know that there's times where we're able to reveal ourselves, and there's times where it takes time and we have to speak with tact in order to reach that person's heart first before they have to receive the gospel, right? So let's look at Tuesday's lesson. Tuesday, for such a time as this. Let's go to Esther chapter 3. Esther chapter 3. And we're going to look at verses 1 to 5. Esther chapter 3, verses 1 to 5. And who wants to read that for us? Esther chapter 3, verse 1 to 5. Who's going to read that for us? Esther chapter 3, verse 1 to 5. Gary, you want to read that for us?
After these things did King
Ahasuerus, yes. Good enough.
promote Human, a son of the aggregate, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes that were with him. And all the king's servants that were in the king's gate bowed reverence Human, for the king had no command concerning him. But Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence. 3. Then the king's servants which were in the king's gate said to Mordecai, Why transgresseth thou the king's commandment? Now it came to pass, when they spake daily unto him, and he hearkened unto them, that they told Human to see whether Mordecai matters would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew.
Verse 5.
And when Haman saw that Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence, then was Haman full of wrath.
And so, stop there. Thank you, Gary. So, in Esther 3, verse 1 to 5, we see that now Mordecai is brought into the scene, and now it focuses on him and how he is now a witness, right? And not only does Mordecai come, but we see Haman the Agagite. Now, what's so important about Haman? Well, first of all, Haman is now one of the king's top people, right? And serving the king. Now, if you notice how it says Haman the Agagite, right? And then in verse 8 and verse 9 and verse 10, Haman goes to the king, right? After Mordecai refused to bow to him. And not only that, in verses 1 through 5, you see that Mordecai is now witnessing to other people who ask him, why don't you bow down to Haman, right? But he boldly proclaims that he is a what? That he's a Jew. So now he tells Esther to conceal herself, but he is bold enough to tell people that he is a Jew, right? Now, why would he do that in contrast?
He's not willing to bow down to Haman.
That's right. So he's not willing to bow down to Haman. Why else? Why would he do in contrast to Esther? Now he's bold in saying that I'm a Jew. That's okay. Why would Mordecai do an opposite of what he told Esther? Because now he's boldly saying that I am a Jew.
They asked him a question.
Huh?
They asked him a question.
That's true. They asked him a question. Why don't you bow down to Haman? And I can also see that it's okay for Mordecai because he already works for the king. And he already has status within the kingdom. Other than Esther, she's different, right? Her status is a little different as a woman and also as being the queen of the household. There's two different positions there. And so not only that, he was a man. I could also see he was, because it's a court where men, rule the most. I think it was okay for him to be more bold about how being a Jew. And then you see with Haman, he comes in verse 8 to 10. Who wants to read verse 8 to 10 for us? So now he's mad, not just mad, but he's full of wrath, says the Bible. And what does he do with King Ahasuerus? Bob, you want to read that for us?
Haman said unto King Ahasuerus, there are certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the province of thy kingdom. And their laws are diverse from all people. Neither keep they the king's laws, therefore it is not for the king's profit to suffer them. If it please the king, let it be written that they may be destroyed. I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the hands of those that have the charge of the business, to bring it into the king's treasury. And the king took his ring from his hand and gave it into Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the Jews' enemy.
So here in verse 10 it says that Haman the Agagite is the Jews' enemy. Now if we look back into earlier time in the Bible, the term the Agagite comes from King Agag. And the worst enemy of the Israelites during and earlier times were the Amalekites, right? The Amalekites were always warring more than any other people with the Israelites. And so Haman actually comes from that. Remember that God had actually given a command to Saul and to the Israelites to exterminate all of the Amalekites. But did Saul obey? No. He actually kept the king alive. And so since he kept the king alive, the king's name was Agag. And so that's where Haman comes in, and he's still there. The enemy of the Jews is still existing till today. And notice how it's now in a different location in the foreign land, that now they're going at it again. But notice in verse 8 that Haman, he comes because he's so full of wrath, now he wants to make a law, right? Now, the lesson says, what does this tell us about how easy it is to let cultural differences blind us to humanity to all people? But I can see that it's more than cultural differences between the Agagite and between the Jews. It's more of worship, right? We can see here how because Mordecai wasn't wanting to bow down and to listen to Haman, and Haman is full of wrath because now Mordecai won't worship me, now I need to go make a law to destroy those people, right? And notice how in verse 8, when Haman comes, he doesn't tell the specifics of who the people are that he wants to destroy. He just says there is a diverse people, and king, coming to you. In just the last chapter, there's a guy who tried to kill you. So we're trying to find these people that are trying to destroy your people, and they're trying to go against your laws. So he doesn't exactly say that it's the Jewish people. And so he actually kind of, in a sense, tricks King Ahasuerus to make this law. Now, is this the first time that a king was tricked into signing a law? Definitely not. We can see in Daniel with King Darius, right? With King Darius, when they had told him, oh, king, live forever, sign a law that nobody can bow to anybody else but to you, right? And so he signs it, not knowing that it would affect his friend Daniel. And so King Ahasuerus didn't know that it was going to affect his own wife, right? And not only that, he didn't know his wife was a Jew in the first place. And so we can actually see that actually Haman is very, very deceptive in the way that he makes this law. I don't have that much time left, but let's read to Esther 4, verse 1 to 3. Esther 4, verse 1 to 3. Now the law is signed. Now what does Mordecai and the people do? Esther 4, verse 1 to 3, and then read on to verse 8 to 16. Who wants to read that for us? Carrie, could you read that for us?
Mordecai learned of all that had been done. He tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went up into the city where the cloud was with him. But he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. In every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. And
Verse 8 to 16.
He also gave him a copy of a text and edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show Esther and explain it to her. And he told him to urge her to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him. Meantime went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed the state of all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that any man or woman who approaches the king in a court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that he be put to death. The only exception to this is for the king to extend the gold scepter to him and spare his life. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. When Esther's first reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer: Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance to the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this? Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa, and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will fast as you do. When this is done, we will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish.
So now we see here where the great controversy theme is very pulled out here too. In verse 1 to 3 and verse 8 to 16, we can see how now that the law is made, Mordecai and all the Jews of the city and all the provinces, now they're fasting. I mean, not exactly fasting, but they're mourning. They're mourning. Because now it seems as if there's no hope. Because we know in the Persian courts that once a law is made, that's it, right? It cannot be changed. It cannot be altered. It's permanent, right? So now it seems as if there's no hope. And Esther is wondering, what's all this mourning in the city that's happening? And so she sends one of the chamberlains to Mordecai to try to give him, new clothes. But then he refuses. And then she sends him to go ask him what's going on, right? What is happening? And that's where she finally learns of the law that is made that includes herself to be destroyed, right? And so notice that he sends a message to her and said, who knows? For if you were brought to be queen for such a time as this. Are we a royal priesthood that's brought out for such a time as this? Definitely. And notice how her first answer, she says, well, I haven't seen the king in 30 days. I haven't been called or summoned before him. Then he sends a message back and saying that, do not think just because of your position that you will not perish among the people, right? But if you keep silent, know that your house will be destroyed, right? So notice how it's a great lesson for us as missionaries of the gospel that there will be a time when we no longer have to keep silent. Now we have to speak up and speak the truth and be bold for God and during that time. And was she bold? Definitely. But the first thing that she did, that's a good lesson for us in training to be witnesses for the gospel, she went first to who? Before she went to the king. She went first to God. She gathered all the Jews and says to fast and pray for her for 3 days, right? And then I will go. So she knew first and foremost that it only took the power of God to save all her people through her, right? It was not her of herself, but she was the instrument that now that God was going to use to save her people. In the end, we know that they were saved. In fact, they were saved to the point that many of the Persians were converted to be Jews because of that great act that she had done and going to intercede for her people. So I pray that we may be able to apply these principles for us each day. That yes, it's a great story, it's a great love story, but yet Esther has a true significance for us now in these days and these times. So continue to pray for one another, be there for one another, and to encourage one another. There will come a time when we will be brought before kings, before judges, and before rulers to show people of who we are as Seventh-day Adventists, right? Let's pray. Lord Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for the story of Esther and showing us and being a missionary for the gospel to the world. Father, we know that there's principles in our that you have set for us in your word. I pray that you help us to apply it to our everyday life. Father, we just humbly ask as we enter into the divine service of worship on your Sabbath. I pray, Father, for your Holy Spirit to continue to dwell within our hearts. Change our hearts, Father, that they may be fully dedicated to you and surrendered all, that even in the face of death, that we may be able to speak up for you. Thank you so much, Father, for answering and hearing this prayer, because we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
So I was working with Fork. He has a whole PowerPoint he's doing. It's going to be, I'm